Great. Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and congratulations on organising this conference around these very important themes. In a moment, I'm going to give you an example of how we in the Resolution Foundation use different types of data to try to understand better this generational challenge, intergenerational fairness. But I think we should approach this whole subject of the use of data with a degree of confidence about our capacities in the UK. And we have got some distinctive advantages which we can take some pride in. And I'd mention two in particular. First of all, there's one kind of view of the world where there's just a massive amount of random data. And that, to some extent, is that's a valid way of looking at it. What we've got in the UK is some really useful structured data sets, often with far more history and being collected with far more rigour than almost any other country. And having those kind of structures is a great advantage. And secondly, we do write pretty good software to analyse this data. One of our strengths is the construction of effective software. Ironically, I think one of the reasons is we don't have the world's most powerful computers. Those kind of rather vulgar lists of where the world's 500 most powerful computers are to be found, there's only a relatively small number of those in the UK. But if you haven't got massive amounts of computing power to throw at any problem you wish to address, it makes it even more important that your software is effective and smart and uses the minimum necessary number of calculations in order to achieve a result. So we've got some quite strong data sets and we've got some pretty good software. And one example of what we can do that other countries find hard to do is from life sciences, where the challenge of linking genetic data to actual patient data is one which Britain is better able to tackle than almost anyone else. I went to the US actually with a group of British geneticists and health researchers and medical professors to look at how the US was trying to make those connections. And it was pretty much impossible. You have random health episodes. You'll be treated at one hospital. If something goes wrong, there's virtually no link to any childhood medical data. You might move from one insurance company to another. The challenge, for them, therefore, linking genetic sequencing with actual information about people's own medical history, that's before you even get into other data about their environment, has proved very, very hard to do. Whereas in the UK, we are making progress to that, including in some very special places. Salford is one of the few places in England where they've got online primary care data, online secondary care data, and they may now increasingly be linking that to genetic data as well. So we have got some capabilities. Though there are other areas where we are behind the US when it comes to social mobility, although we are now linking more data, understanding the granularity of people moving through the education system and out into the jobs market and how mobile they are. There we are heavily dependent on cohort studies from 1958 and 1970. 2 points do not make a trend. Whereas if I look at what Raj Chetty, for example, does in the US, he uses a far wider range of data, and as a result, he's able to come up with really interesting findings. It's reaching the point where he can identify when the principal of a college leaves that college and a successor comes in who may be a better performer. 10 years on, you can observe the labour market outcomes of the students at the college starting to rise. There's things like that where we are way behind what you can do with proper analysis of big data in social policy. Well, let me now show what we have been doing in the resolution. Now, let me trace the space. Right. Let me tell you what we've done and then draw some wider lessons. And what I'm going to cite is evidence from a range of different sources, different types of data sets. This is, first of all, attitudinal data. And this tells us that most people think, 59% of people agree, that a kind of key part of the social contract is we think successive generations should be better off than the generation before. That is part of the promise of a modern Western economy. But they don't think it's happening. And the red colours on the left in particular are evidence that, especially amongst younger people, this is attitudinal attitudinal research that shows that there is a lot of anxiety that today's young people, aged 17 to 36, will have a worse life than their parents. This, I think, is a key part of our national anxiety. Will our kids have the same kind of opportunities in life that we have had? So that's attitudinal stuff. Let's stick with that for a tiny bit longer. Where do we see the most vivid examples of this breakdown of the intergenerational contract? What do people think are the reasons why it's going to be worse for the younger generation? And these are the top three. Housing is overwhelmingly the crucial issue. Housing costs, being able to own your own home, considerable anxiety about housing. Then, interestingly, more than I expected, anxiety about pensions. And, of course, thirdly, performance in the labour market. And the labour market is one of our particular areas of expertise. And I'm now going to give you now some move from attitudinal evidence to labour market evidence. And this is a type of graph that you'll see several examples of. We first of all break society up into different age cohorts. These are quite narrow age cohorts, as you can see. These are generational cohorts, people born between certain periods. And then we track, as they age, things like what has happened to their pay. And what you can see here is that contrary to what we would have hoped, oh, sorry, that does go backwards. There we go. That's right. Contrary to what you might have hoped, where this is the classic path, successive generations, as they go through life, earning a bit more at any one age than the generation that came before them. But if you come over here to the more recent generations, people born in the 1980s, for whom we now begin to get some evidence of their path through the labour market, it is by no means as good. It looks as if this progress is stalling, and indeed some of them are now earning less than previous generations did at the same age. So this is ONS labour force survey data that tells us that this attitudinal data is not based on mythology. There is something real happening here. That's the pay data. Then here we've got the increasing proportion of income going in housing costs. And again, you can see if you take, and we're using here, and by the way, when I wrote a book about this, I tried to get a sense of what the different birth cohorts are. There is no official definition. As soon as you go beyond every successive 5 years, it's very hard, but I, drawing on a lot of other debate, defined baby boomers as that age group, which is essentially covers the two peaks in the birth rate, then Generation X, then millennials. And if you look at how much of their income young boomers were spending on their housing costs when they're in their 20s and 30s, then this is, interestingly, high interest rates during the tough times of the 70s and 80s. And then look at what the youngest generation going into the labour market now, the millennials, are doing. You can see it's not just that their pay is underperforming, but a much higher proportion of their income is having to go on meeting their housing costs. And whereas in the past that might have been mortgages, at least they were getting, it was at least getting them a home that they would own at the end of the day, that increasingly nowadays means rent. Rent often going to baby boomers who've bought a flat down the road and renting it out and are collecting the rent from the younger generation. And indeed, as they are renting, many more of them are in very secure tenure. This is, again, labour force survey. If you put all this together, you have indeed got a real problem of living standards for no longer rising for successive generations. It does look, once we allow for housing costs, as if for the millennials, compared with Generation X before them, born between 66 and 80, there's basically been no improvement in their living standards at any age in their 20s or early 30s. So we've seen here, in just a very quick tour, we've seen some attitudinal evidence about what people are worried about, and we've seen some labour market and also here family resource survey evidence that tells us there is something in this attitudinal evidence. These attitudes rest on real evidence. Now, we, as well as labour market evidence, we've tried also to look at this from a different perspective, cross-check against consumption data. Because, of course, income information from things like the labour force survey is not conclusive evidence of how people are actually living their lives. It's worth seeing how they are consuming, and for that we can look at different data sets and see if we get a similar picture or a different one. So more recently, we've also been using things like the household survey. And first of all, consumption and income are not the same thing, an obvious point, but if you care about the way in which people actually lead their lives, you might want to track what's happening to consumption. And here, interestingly, by the way, some quite sobering evidence that consumption, ever since the crash, is, if anything, declined. This tells us that there's a national problem of the standard of living in terms of what we're actually consuming, not really advancing. Though, of course, there's a deep debate about whether this is fully capturing quality effects. We don't know, and that's something that the statisticians are very aware of. Here is an interesting piece of evidence about how people are spending their money and how this is changing over time. And again, you can see the rise in the proportion of income that the younger generation in particular are having to devote to housing as against other spending. So this, from a different measure, through a consumption measure, is rather confirming the other analysis we got, which was looking at income and setting that against information about housing costs. And here's a different way of presenting it, but here again is the evidence that of the shift in the way in which we are spending our money, with particularly a big decline in food costs appearing to be the main factor that's offsetting the rise in some other costs. So this is patterns of non-household consumption, and this is telling us that we're eating out more and we're eating in less. It's telling us as well that transport costs have interestingly become a significantly bigger part of patterns of spending, probably because, not least because of housing pressures, people are having to do longer commutes and travel further. So I've tried very briefly to show how my interest in intergenerational fairness can then be analysed through a range of different statistical measures. We finally have tried to measure this against some of the popular misconceptions that you get about, well, what's happening to young people and what's the explanation. One of the arguments that you sometimes hear is that what's really happening is that young people are living it up by eating out more. And this shows which group have seen the biggest shifts in eating out. And actually, the trend of spending more on eating out, whilst, if anything, reducing spend on eating in, is most prominent amongst the affluent boomers. And it looks as if, particularly for the youngest group, for all people in the youngest group, there has been a significant shift in their spending on eating in, but with barely any increase in spending on eating out. So further evidence, this is a group that's under financial pressure. So the idea that I sometimes hear from my baby boomer friends, but they're always out at the pub, they're out eating out every night. No, if anything, the driver of increased spending on eating out is driven by changing patterns of expenditure amongst older age groups rather than younger age groups. Are they spending all their money on iPhones? They are spending quite a lot on iPhones, but again, no massive difference. It would be hard to say that they were putting a lot more money into it than older generations. So you can use survey data to track patterns of consumption on particular goods. This was a piece of work we commissioned at the Resolution Foundation. I don't think it'd quite been looked at in this way before, analysing the living costs and food survey with some quite interesting results, able to challenge some preconceptions, and even are they all travelling? And again, what you find is actually the people who really are spending more money on travelling, it's a more significant shift over time, greater prosperity amongst an older age group. So some of those pictures, those presumptions about what young people are doing, well, the reason why they're all renting is they're not bothering to save to have a home, and instead they're blowing all their money on travel and their iPhones and eating out, not really confirmed by the data. But the data is unreliable, and there's quite a lively debate, and I should, in the interests of intellectual integrity, which is what this group is all about, there is a growing debate about why consumption evidence from the national accounts is different from household consumption expenditure data, and it's hard to make sense of this gap, but we have got a reporting issue, a recording problem, and there may be people in this room who are more expert than me, but this is just a warning that you find different data sets with different messages, and it's very hard to work out which is necessarily the case. Now, let me conclude with just some of the things that we don't know. When I write about this, I'm very aware of some of the underlying issues, and you may be, because you represent many different organizations and groups collecting data, you may have data that, interpreted by smart researchers, helps us address some of these questions. On consumption, what is the underlying rationale for changes in pattern of consumption? Sometimes we're told that in a modern economy, younger generation don't attach so much weight to owning things as older generations. I have a car parked outside our house in West London, which we drive pretty infrequently. And I'm sure in the future people will look back and think having a big lump of metal occupying a London street just sitting there for 95% of the time is an incredibly inefficient way of organising modern life. And there does seem to be a shift in attitudes away from car ownership amongst the younger generation, much greater flexibility using an Uber and perhaps renting a car for a weekend if you're hoping to drive out of London to see friends. So there's been changes like that. However, when we look at housing, we don't see a similar change in values. When we ask young people whether they aspire to own their own home, yes, they do. They still have a desire for home ownership, but they seem to have lost a desire for car ownership. But trying to make sense of where values are shifting and where they're not shifting is really important. And also, are these generational effects or are they period effects? All of us are changed by economic circumstances and wider cultural changes. If you look at attitudes to gay people, 60-year-olds now are far more tolerant than they were as 30-year-olds 30 years ago. And that's one form that progress takes. The other thing that is clearly observable is that the young generation start out far more tolerant than previous generations did. But trying to disentangle period effects, cultural changes that affect us all, and different cohorts having different values is also very important, and a lot of analysis doesn't disentangle period effects and cohort effects. Another area where we need to know more is attitudes and dependence between different generations. To what extent is the bank of mom and dad a reality? To what extent do the older generation think they have a responsibility for the younger generation? Or is the reality that the older generation are much more interested in spending their money on a third foreign holiday than on using it to subsidize their 20-something or 30-something kids? And what kind of responsibilities are there thought to be? When we talk to financial advisors who are constructing new ways in which affluent baby boomers can support their kids through things like remortgaging their house so as to help their kids get started on the housing ladder, things like that, or helping out with a loan from the bank of mom and dad to help their kids buy their first flat. One of the difficulties they've identified is that, for example, the parents might think it's a loan and the kids might assume it's a gift. So the parents think they're going to get this money back because it is a bank, and the kids think it's an unconditional grant with a lot of subsequent intergenerational tension within the family. So there might be different attitudes at different sides of the transaction. We don't know enough about that. Are we shifting to a world in which the main way in which we discharge our obligations between the generations is within the family? My kind of conceptual framework, and I'm open to challenge from the evidence, but my conceptual framework goes rather like this. I think of us as a society with greater levels of age segregation. Greater age segregation at work, greater age segregation in where we live, and almost, for a whole range of social attitudes, greater age segregation going right back to schooling. When you go to infant schools or nurseries, you see those tiresome little fences to keep the 4-year-olds away from the 2-year-olds, as if there's an assumption that there's a threat if you have different age groups. The 4-year-olds were bound to be horrible to the 2-year-olds unless we keep them apart. So quite a lot of wariness of intergenerational connections. British Airways will not put a single male who is travelling alongside teenagers or young adults if their seating policy can possibly avoid it. They think that's a bad thing. So a lot of implicit assumptions about keeping the generations apart, leading to greater age segregation. But meanwhile, as family size shrinks and life expectancy improves, so within the family, you have fewer siblings, but you have greater, more long-lasting links between the generations, more likely to know your grandparents, increasing numbers of people with great-grandparents. So my kind of picture of British society is tall, thin, beanpole families as the increasingly significant form of intergenerational communication and exchange in a wide, flat, horizontally age-segregated society, which might help explain some of the problems we have in improving social mobility. It means that the family is becoming, contrary to what a lot of modernists predicted, the family is not becoming less important, it's becoming more important as the main surviving form of intergenerational exchange. Now, as I say, that's a kind of theory I have, and you can collect some data. There is some evidence on greater age segregation at work. It seems to be driven heavily by rapid change in business sectors. If you're in a PR company or an internet service company, you're very likely to be under 35. If you're in a manufacturing industry, you're highly likely to be over 50. So it may be driven by changes in the structure of the British economy. But more evidence in this area, and again, you may, in your different ways, have data sets that help illuminate that debate, would be really helpful. And then, finally, something that I'm sure you do wrestle with, what the impacts of all these policies are, to what extent people are susceptible to appeals to the interests of other generations. And sometimes I'm criticised. People think I'm a sort of advocate promoting generational warfare. I'm a believer in intergenerational collaboration. And the good news is that older people do feel an obligation to the younger generation. When I was a democratically elected politician, when I represented my constituency, my former constituency of Havant on the south coast, when I started, the local newspaper always reported the rejection of a planning application as a success for the local community, and an agreement that houses should be built as a blow to the local community. That was very simply, that was the dominant narrative. So it was always local community groups successfully fend off proposal to build new lock-up flats versus local groups sadly defeated as appalling councillors agree to build block-up flats. That was essentially the political narrative for the first 15 or so years that I was an MP. And most MPs operate within that environment. If you track the polling evidence, and so my problem was, if I was in my former constituency with a meeting with a residents association group, something like the number of people in this room today, almost all aged over 50, all active in the local community, trying to do good, serving on various charities, all owning their own home, and I went to try to defend a planning application to build a new housing estate. So all start with the assumption that the housing estate was a bad thing and it should be stopped. And I found the only way I could possibly get into this argument was by saying to them, but don't you want your children or grandchildren possibly to have a home of their own? And I know the estate where you live. Those houses were built in the 1960s on green fields for you guys. And if they could be built on green fields in the 1960s for you guys, why can't we do the same today for future generations? And it was the appeal to the interests of future generations that was the only way you could win that argument. And when you look at the polling evidence, there has been a shift in attitudes. I don't think I haven't got the slide today, but in 2010, about 25% of adults agreed that more housing needed to be built in their area. By 2015, that had risen to about 50% of adults accepting that more housing needed to be built in their area. So attitudes can change by appealing to the interests of the younger generation. And the other side of this, interestingly, the younger generation don't object to public spending on pensions. They think that they want their granny to be living comfortably and able to afford to heat her flat or house through the winter. So young people are not against public spending on pensioners. If anything, they're more tough on public spending on benefits for the working age population and low-income working families. But those type of attitudes, what people think about other generations, how much they value future generations, is another area where we need more data. So that's basically my conclusion. I think that intergenerational equity is a really important topic. I think it's fascinating. It's increasingly important in the political debate. It's increasingly important in doing things like understanding patterns of consumption expenditure. We at Resolution Foundation are wrestling with trying to make sense of it and get data about it. And any person here who thinks that you've got a data set that is relevant to the work we do at Resolution Foundation on this issue, I'd be delighted to hear from you. Thank you very much indeed.
Questions that you'd like to put to David?
Yes, Paul.
I work at University College London, and I'm a geographer. And one of the data sets that we've looked at is the geography of family names. Okay? And some of the results we looked at suggest that your name, first coined sometime between the 12th and the 14th century, still today very much determines your life chances, your level of affluence and so forth, where you are, determines your family history and your family outcome. We have quite vigorous debates with social historians from the London School of Economics who say the exact opposite. By tracing rare family names in different locations, they say basically wealth is a more directly inherited characteristic than height. And so in terms of the debate about intergenerational inheritance and transfer of wealth. I was just interested where you and the Resolution Foundation perhaps sit on that, whether you sit with the geographers or the geneticists in a sense.
Well, I mean, it's. I'm not familiar with all this evidence that you refer to. My instinct is that the genetic element over the centuries couldn't be that strong. I mean, there is. So I'm thinking it's more a series of social arrangements than a matter of genetic inheritance. I'm trying to assess the... And there is a piece of evidence, though, isn't there, that if you've got a fairly common name, the police are very likely to be able to work out your surname from your genetic sequence. I think we do know there's a sufficiently strong association between genetics and a social identity that we can link them up. Not, of course, that the police are necessarily allowed to do that, but there is. I think you could. I think it has been done. But I think ultimately I am with the geographers on that. Yeah.
So I have a question myself. I'll grab the progress. Given the number of retailers in the room and those with other forms of data, have you done in the Resolution about any work with that sort of data about changing consumption? Because they clearly must have lots of it.
No, we commissioned a researcher, Donald Hirsch, who did the... We didn't have the capacity in-house in Resolution Foundation. We're a relatively small organisation. So we commissioned Donald Hirsch who did the research that was the basis for the consumption evidence I cited. You know, what are people actually spending their money on? How has that changed over time? And how does it differ at any point in time between different age cohorts? And he in turn then went to various nationwide measures of patterns of consumption, things like the Family Resource Survey. But then that's why there may be, and we have limited capacities at Resolution, but there must be within the retail sector an enormous amount of evidence about what people are spending on, changes in patterns over time, what people of different ages are spending on. And I personally think at the moment the academic social research community is not as connected as it could be to that kind of consumer data. Now, it may be that you're all saying it's one of the most precious assets we've had, and we're not going to allow our company's information about patterns of consumption to be more widely used. But given the purpose of this conference and this group, anything that made that kind of material more accessible to researchers on whatever, obviously, protected, confidential, anonymised basis would be really helpful.
Well, this is clearly a full toss to the Consumer Data Research Centre. It's already got some of that data in situ, if you like, in anonymised. Sorry, I'm grabbing the phone now. Is there somebody? Bob, at the back, please.
Thank you. Fascinating presentation. One aspect
of intergenerational transfers was that in the past, inflation was a very good way of taking money from elderly savers and passing it on to the younger generation by whittling away at their loans. That having largely disappeared, do you see that as one of the factors? Because it wasn't one of the factors that you mentioned, but it also fits into the housing argument that you're putting.
I think that's a very good point. And of course, the trouble is when you get interested in intergenerational issues, as I do, it's a bit like kind of if you've got a hammer, you're always on the lookout for a nail. And if I were a conspiracy theorist, and occasionally I do become one, occasionally the conspiracy theorist narrative goes very simply. When this very large cohort of baby boomers who have a lot of political power, when they were in their 20s and 30s and had taken out a mortgage, they had a massive interest in quite high rates of inflation so as to reduce the value of their debt. But as they become older and have paid off their mortgages, they have much greater interest in the virtues of low inflation. And if you look at the changes in inflation rates, Again, is it an accident or how did it happen? When they were young, they lived in a high inflation society, and now they're old, they live in a low inflation society, which has worked out very well for them. Now, I don't think it's ever as explicit in people's minds as that, but you could imagine, because these are very large, big swathes of voters, you could imagine they're being more willing in later life to vote for low inflation policies than when they were younger. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely onto something, and I think it's exactly where you do find these kind of demographic factors have significant explanatory power.
Any other questions? I'll grab the chat. One more. Given what's been said at the moment, when you've looked at the different generation divide, have you looked at the ethnic split across those at all?
Now and that is a very fair challenge, and we are doing a bit of that now. What we've got at the Resolution Foundation is we've set up what we call an Intergenerational Commission, which I chair. And it is true to say that in our published work, we've only just started getting into that aspect. We ought to cover that as well. Of course, some immigrant or minority ethnic groups have a different age structure, depending on when, for example, they migrated into the UK. So it is a complicating factor, and I would plead guilty. We probably need to do more analysis on that than we've had the capacity to do so far.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.